The treehouse had always been a special place, perched high among the branches in the backyard. It was a refuge from childhood storms and long summer days filled with laughter. I hadn't been back here since I'd left for college, and now, years later, standing beneath the familiar wooden planks, it felt almost like coming home. The treehouse had barely changed. The wood was weathered, the ladder creaked under my weight, but it was still sturdy, still a safe haven hidden away from the world. I had come back to town to visit my family, and though I had changed over the years, some things had remained the same. Like Rose, she was a close friend of my mother, a woman who had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember. She was the kind of person you never really forget, even as you grow up and life pulls you in different directions. There was a quiet strength about her, a warmth that made her feel like family. She was in her early 60s now, her hair streaked with silver, her laugh as contagious as ever. When I saw her again after all those years, something felt different. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, or perhaps it was the way I looked at her, noticing things I hadn't before. I found myself paying attention to her gestures, the way her smile lingered a little longer, the subtleness in her gaze when we talked. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a quiet spark, something unspoken that simmered just beneath the surface. It was on a particularly quiet afternoon that Rose invited me to the treehouse. We had been catching up in the backyard, sharing stories and laughing over memories. And before I knew it, she had suggested we go up to the old refuge. I haven't been up there in years, she said, a nostalgic smile tugging at her lips. It used to be our little secret spot. The idea of returning to the treehouse felt oddly exciting, a reminder of simpler times, of hidden places and shared secrets. I climbed up the old ladder, feeling the wood groan under my weight, and Rose followed behind, her movements careful but steady. When we settled in, sitting on the worn floorboards, the air between us felt charged with an intimacy that was both familiar and strange. The walls were covered with remnants of childhood, old sketches, faded marks from when we'd measured our heights, memories etched into the wood. We talked for a while about life and love, about things we had never shared with anyone else. She told me about her marriage, how she had loved deeply, but also lost a lot, and I listened, feeling an unexpected connection grow between us. Her voice softened as she spoke, her gaze turning thoughtful, as though she were lost in some distant memory. I could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the hint of sadness that she usually kept hidden behind her easy smiles. "You know," she said, after a pause, her voice barely more than a whisper, "there's something about this place that makes you feel safe." Her gaze met mine, and for a moment we were both silent, lost in the weight of what hung unspoken between us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a mix of anticipation and uncertainty, as if we were on the edge of something we couldn't quite name. Without thinking, I reached out, placing my hand over hers. The touch was gentle, hesitant, but I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling I couldn't quite place. She looked down at our hands, her fingers curling slightly under mine, and I sensed a tension in her that mirrored my own. There was a part of me that wanted to pull away, to retreat back into the comfort of familiarity, but another part, a bolder, braver part, urged me to stay, to see where this would lead. She took a deep breath, her gaze lingering on our entwined hands, before shifting back to meet my eyes. "I never expected," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "to feel this way. Not now. Not after all these years." Her words hung in the air, each one heavy with meaning, and I could see the conflict in her eyes, the mixture of desire and restraint that mirrored my own. There was a raw honesty in her gaze, a vulnerability that made me feel as if she had stripped away every pretense, allowing me to see the real her, the part of her that she kept hidden from the world. I know, I murmured, my voice barely audible, yet somehow I knew she understood. I didn't have the words to explain what I felt, the strange pull that had drawn us together, but in that moment, words seemed unnecessary. She reached up, her fingers tracing a gentle line along my cheek, a touch so soft that it sent shivers down my spine. We were sitting close now, our faces inches apart, our breaths mingling in the quiet air of the treehouse. I could feel the heat radiating from her, a warmth that seemed to envelop me, grounding me in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. There was a part of me that wanted to close the distance between us, to give in to the pull I felt, but another part hesitated, uncertain of what crossing that line would mean. As if sensing my hesitation, she pulled back slightly, her hand dropping to her lap. A faint smile played at the corners of her lips, a mixture of sadness and understanding. "We don't have to do anything," she said softly, her voice laced with a gentleness that made my heart ache. As if sensing my surprise, she began to speak, calming my temper, making me smile, but I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the same doubt that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I knew that if I let this moment slip away, I might never get another chance to explore what lay between us, to see if the connection we felt was real. And so, I reached out, my hand finding hers once more, my fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both comforting and charged with unspoken intent. "Rose?" I whispered, my voice unsteady, my gaze fixed on hers. "I don't know where this will lead, but I want to be here with you. Now." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, and in that moment I felt as though we were both standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. Her fingers tightened around mine, a silent acknowledgement of the choice we were making, the line we were about to cross, and a precondition, my face turned pink with fear. The silence that settled between us was thick with anticipation, each second stretching into eternity as we lingered on the precipice, neither of us willing to break the fragile spell that had woven itself around us. And then, slowly, hesitantly, she leaned forward, her face inches from mine, her gaze holding mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. When her lips brushed against mine, it was gentle, tentative, as if testing the waters, exploring the depths of the connection we shared. My heart raced, pounding in my chest like a drum, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Her hand came up to rest on my cheek, her touch soft and feather-light, yet grounding me in a way that made me feel safe, cherished. We stayed like that, caught in a quiet embrace, our breaths mingling in the warm air of the treehouse. I could feel the weight of the years between us, the memories we had shared, the unspoken bond that had woven itself into the fabric of our lives. And in that moment, I knew that what we had was something rare, something precious, a connection that transcended words or explanations. When we finally parted, her eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of wonder and vulnerability, as though she too was trying to make sense of the emotions that had swept over us. We sat there in silence, the only sounds, the soft rustling of leaves outside, the distant calls of birds. Yet words felt unnecessary, each of us lost in the quiet intimacy of the moment. But as the silence stretched on, I felt a hint of uncertainty creep into my mind, a reminder of the world outside, of the lines we had crossed. I could see the same doubt reflected in her eyes, a flicker of fear, as though she were afraid of what this meant, of what the future might hold. We lingered in that silence, the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing down on us, heavy and charged. I could feel the warmth of her hand still in mine, grounding me, even as my mind raced. This was a line we'd crossed, a step we'd taken without fully knowing where it would lead. And yet, sitting there with her, it felt as though it had always been leading here. The years of friendship, shared memories, quiet moments, they had all woven into something deeper, something that neither of us had anticipated, but couldn't ignore. As if sensing my thoughts, Rose leaned back, her gaze flickering to the small window where the late afternoon light streamed in, casting warm hues across the worn wood of the treehouse. "I'm not sure what to make of this," she said softly, almost to herself. Her hand was still in mine, her fingers gently tracing small circles against my skin, a touch that was both comforting and electric. "But there's something here, isn't it?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with an earnest vulnerability, and I could see the same uncertainty, the same longing that mirrored my own. "There is," I admitted, my voice low, a hint of hesitation woven into each word. "I don't think either of us expected it, but here we are." She smiled, a small wistful smile that tugged at my heart. "You know, I'd always thought that by this stage in life, I'd have things figured out, that there wouldn't be any more surprises." Her voice softened, her gaze distant. "But somehow, with you, everything feels new again. It's like," and seeing the world differently, I felt a strange mix of emotions rise within me, a sense of awe, of wonder at the connection we shared, but also a deep respect for the woman before me, a woman who had lived through so much, yet could still find beauty in the unknown. "You make me feel the same way," I said quietly, my gaze locked onto hers. "It's like all these years we've known each other, but only now I see you." A silence settled over us, one that felt intimate and sacred, as though we were both coming to terms with the shift that had taken place. I could see her wrestling with the same thoughts, the same questions that swirled in my mind. And yet, despite everything, there was a calmness in her expression, a quiet acceptance of whatever this was. It wasn't a decision made in haste or with the reckless abandon of youth. It was something deeper, more profound, a recognition of a bond that had been waiting to be acknowledged. Rose's hand tightened around mine, her fingers trembling slightly, betraying the vulnerability that she so rarely let show. "I don't know what happens next," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her gaze searching mine. "But I want to be here, with you. I don't want to let this go." The honesty in her words struck a chord within me, stirring emotions I hadn't even realized I was capable of feeling. There was something raw, almost primal, about the connection we shared, a depth that defied explanation. In that moment, I knew that I was willing to embrace whatever came next, to face the unknown with her, because this, whatever it was real. It was tangible, a bond that had been forged through years of friendship, of quiet moments, and unspoken understanding. Slowly, I leaned in, my gaze flickering between her eyes, searching for any hint of doubt, of hesitation. But there was none. Her gaze softened, her lips parting slightly, and I could see the same longing, the same hunger that mirrored my own. When our lips met, it was gentle, tentative, as though we were both testing the waters, exploring the depths of the connection we had discovered. My hand slipped up to my face, her fingers brushing softly against my cheek, a touch so light that it sent shivers down my spine. The kiss deepened, each moment drawing us closer, and I could feel the weight of everything we had left unsaid pressing down on us, grounding us in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. There was a part of me that was acutely aware of the boundaries we were crossing. The line that had once separated us, now blurred, but another part, one that had long remained dormant, was ready to embrace the unknown, to step into the uncertainty with her. When we finally pulled back, our breaths mingling in the warm, still air of the treehouse, she looked at me with an intensity that left me breathless. Her gaze held a depth of emotion that spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of the path we had chosen, of the journey we were about to embark on. Are you are you sure about this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her hand still resting on my cheek, her thumb brushing lightly against my skin. Yes, I replied, my voice steady, unwavering. I'm sure. Her smile was soft, filled with a mixture of relief and something deeper, something that seemed to resonate with the unspoken bond we shared. We sat there in the tree house, our hands entwined, our breaths mingling in the silence, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, a calmness that seemed to settle over me, grounding me in the present, in the reality of what we had found. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting shadows across the worn wood, I felt a quiet sense of anticipation, a readiness to embrace whatever lay ahead. This wasn't a fleeting moment, a passing fancy. It was something real, something that had been building over the years, waiting to be acknowledged. And now, as we sat there, the world outside fading into the distance, I knew that this was only the beginning. As dusk settled, the treehouse was bathed in a dim, golden glow, the remnants of daylight slipping through the cracks in the walls, casting long shadows across the floor. The air felt thick, laden with the weight of everything we hadn't said, of the quiet understanding that bound us. Our breaths seemed synchronized, a shared rhythm that pulsed between us, and I found myself marveling at how a place so familiar could suddenly feel so different, as if every corner, every worn plank held the memories of moments we'd shared, moments that had all led to this one. Rose's gaze was steady, her eyes reflecting a softness that seemed to reach right into my soul. Her hand, warm and gentle, found mine again, our fingers entwining, as if they had been meant to fit together all along. There was a vulnerability in her touch, an unguarded tenderness that made my chest tighten. She looked at me, her expression filled with an openness I had rarely seen from her, and I could feel the quiet strength beneath her warmth, a strength that had carried her through life's storms, but had now softened, allowing her to fully embrace the present moment with me. Do you remember? She began, her voice a soft murmur. All the times we'd sneak up here, hiding from the world? You always seemed to know when I needed a friend, even when you were just a kid. It's like you've always known me. Her words hung in the air, touching something deep within me, stirring emotions I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. She was right. I had always been drawn to her, had always seen her as more than just my mom's friend. She had been a constant in my life, a figure of comfort and strength, someone who had always seemed to understand me in ways others didn't. But now, looking at her, sitting so close that I could feel the warmth of her body, that connection felt different, deeper, more profound. I think I've always felt close to you, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, my gaze dropping to our entwined hands. Even when I was too young to understand it, you were always there, like a lighthouse guiding me back when I felt lost. Huh. She smiled, a soft, wistful smile that held a trace of sadness, and her fingers tightened around mine. It's strange, isn't it? She murmured, her gaze drifting to the window, where the last rays of sunlight were fading into twilight. How life leads us down unexpected paths, brings us to places we never thought we'd go. There was a heaviness to her words, a sense of melancholy that resonated with me, and I found myself squeezing her hand in silent solidarity. We were both aware of the complexities of what we felt, of the boundaries we were crossing, but in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. All that mattered was the warmth of her hand in mine, the gentle curve of her smile, the quiet acceptance that flowed between us, unspoken yet deeply understood. Rose, I said softly, my voice trembling slightly, as if afraid to break the delicate balance we had found. I don't know where this will lead, but I want to be here with you right now. Her eyes met mine, and I could see the same mixture of longing and hesitation reflected in her gaze. She looked at me as if searching for something, some reassurance. And after a moment, she nodded, her expression softening. "So do I," she whispered, her voice filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "So do I." Slowly, I reached out, my hand trembling slightly as I brushed a strand of hair from her face, tucking it behind her ear. My fingers lingered, tracing the delicate line of her cheek, and I could feel the warmth of her skin, the slight tremor in her breath as she leaned into my touch. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for a brief moment, we were both suspended in a timeless space, caught between the past and the present, and between memory and reality. When she opened her eyes, her gaze was filled with an intensity that left me breathless, and I felt the pull between us, an invisible thread drawing us closer, urging us to close the distance. I leaned in, my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in the quiet of the treehouse. Her lips parted slightly, a silent invitation, and as our faces drew closer, I could feel her breath, warm and steady, mingling with mine. Our lips met in a kiss that was soft, tentative, a gentle exploration of the feelings we had kept hidden for so long. Her hand slipped to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I could feel the weight of her years, the wisdom and strength she carried, grounding me in a way I had never felt before. The kiss deepened, a slow, deliberate merging of our worlds, and I felt myself sinking into her, into the warmth and safety she offered. The world outside faded, leaving only the two of us, wrapped in each other's arms, our breaths mingling in the quiet intimacy of the treehouse. Every touch, every whisper, every gentle caress seemed to carry the weight of unspoken promises, of a bond that went beyond mere attraction or desire. It was a connection that had been forged through years of quiet understanding, a bond that had finally blossomed into something neither of us had anticipated. When we finally pulled back, our foreheads resting together, we were both breathing heavily, the intensity of the moment lingering in the air around us. Her fingers traced gentle circles on the back of my hand, a soothing touch that grounded me, and I could see the same vulnerability, the same sense of wonder reflected in her eyes. She looked at me as if I were something precious, something fragile yet strong, and I felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude for her, for this moment, for the connection we shared. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, my voice filled with a mixture of concern and awe. She smiled, a warm, reassuring smile that eased every lingering doubt. "I am," she replied, her voice steady, filled with a quiet confidence. "More than I've been in a long time." We sat there in silence, our hands still entwined, our gazes locked, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, a calmness that settled over me like a warm blanket. This wasn't a fleeting moment, a spark that would burn out and fade into memory. It was something real, something that had been waiting for us, patiently, until we were ready to embrace it. As the last rays of daylight faded into twilight, casting a soft, ethereal glow across the treehouse, I knew that my life had changed forever. We had crossed a line, had stepped into a new chapter, one that held uncertainties and challenges, but also promises of something deeper, something lasting. And as we sat together, wrapped in each other's arms, I felt a quiet certainty that, whatever the future held, we would face it together, side by side, bound by the unbreakable connection we had found in each other.